The plane didn't exactly crash. But I was on a plane to Tegucigalpa, Honduras from somewhere in Florida, ca. 1997. I was about 11 or 12. The plane had a tire blowout on contact with the runway. I imagine the pilot had a quick decision to make, whether to abort the landing and ascend or to continue. He apparently elected to decelerate the plane and finish landing, with a blown tire. The landing was absurdly violent. We were seated near the front of the plane. I think it was about 4 seated to a row, not a large plane but not a small one either. Somehow the pilot brought the plane to a stop. We all exited via stairs brought to the plane on the runway. Guards were brought in just for the purpose of telling us that we could not take pictures. I tried to get a picture of the mangled landing gear with the blown tire and just had hands up in my face. I remember the snapshot very well though, it was very scary. As for reaction, everyone on the plane immediately started clapping and screaming as the plane came to a stop. The pilot came on the intercom with a very shaky voice, explaining a tire had blown. During the landing they had us brace in crash positions. As for the landing itself, it was the smoothest landing I've ever had. The captain was a real pro and put the plane down with the lightest touch even though he was way above his normal landing speed. On the way off the plane I saw him in the cockpit. He was soaked in sweat and you could tell he was physically and mentally exhausted. I think it was then that it sunk in for me just how much danger we really had been in. My landing made the evening news and I saw it on TV that night in my hotel room. Funny thing was a few months later I received a letter from Southwest denying any emergency took place on that flight. I'm pretty late to this party, but here it goes. I was pretty young, only about 4 or 5, when I was in a plane crash. It was a small one-engine prop plane with just me, my dad, and the pilot who was a family friend. It was caused by engine failure. I don't remember much excerpt my dad's actions. He was sitting in the front co-pilot seat. He reached back to me in the back seat and pulled my winter coat snug around me. It was winter in Cleveland, Ohio. Then he made sure my seat belt was fastened securely. After making sure I was safe, he buckled himself in tightly as well. It is important to note at this point that my dad is a devout Christian. He recounted his perspective to me when I got older, and said that he was certain he was going to die. He said that he was quiet and praying that God would allow his son to live, even if he didn't. Both my dad and the pilot were knocked unconscious on impact, and both severely injured. Dad regained consciousness first and heard me crying in the back of the plane. He told me that his first thoughts were a mix of panic and relief. He panicked, thinking the pilot was probably dead and he has to get out of the wreckage, but he has some relief because my crying meant I was alive. In the end all 3 of us best the odds and survived. I was in a helicopter crash. Everyone was silent during the ordeal other than the pilot who was like, "Everything is fine, fuck, shit, fuick, nope it's okay, fuck, ffffffff fuck, look for the lake to ditch." We were coming down from a mountain cabin flying by sight when fog rolled in. The pilot started sway left and right to find something to get a bearing in the whiteout and he found something. The trees. I will never forget going from total dizzying whiteness to cedar tree branches pressed up against the plexi wood now. The sound of chop chop chop. The smell of Christmas. Smelled like fresh cut Christmas tree I swear. And then the loudest horn ever and a big red light on the dash that said, "Stall." I was in co-pilot seat. Somehow we managed to spot a rock by the lake and the pilot slammed it down hard but amazingly nobody hurt and the smoke from the engine never turned to flame. We were damn lucky and that pilot didn't fly in BC again. He flew power lines in AB after that where one doesn't have sudden whiteouts. I was in a commercial jet that fell from cruising altitude. It was a small jet flying on a now defunct airline. We had just started the descent when the plane tilted and dropped out of the sky. Nose was pointed nearly straight down. I was sitting in the aisle. People were screaming, yelling out, but I can't remember the words. All kinds of crap was flying through the cabin and the flight attendant was nowhere to be seen. My brother and dad were in the seats behind me. I remember thinking about how sad my mom was going to be. And then looking out at the window at the ground. After what seemed like an eternity, the pilot was able to regain control and the plane started to right itself again. For about 15 to 30 seconds, before starting another uncontrolled descent. It was more terrifying the second time around. The ground was far closer. I was certain that I was going to die and looked over at a blonde woman about my age sitting next to me. We hadn't spoken the entire flight, but I reached out in some impulsive desire for human contact at the end. And we held hands as the plane fell out of the sky. I can remember looking at her face briefly. She was crying. As the ground started approaching and you could make out things like trees and houses, I felt a sense of peace fall about me. Death seemed to be certain, but I didn't care. It seemed like it was going to be quick and painless, but I remember being surprised that it was going to all end this way. Then we started to feel the pilot struggling with the plane and it started to right itself again. And for a second time the plane pulled out of the dive. It was still incredibly bumpy and people were crying and screaming out at every round of turbulence. Everyone was waiting for the next and final dive. When we landed, the young woman and I were still holding hands. People were dead quiet. What was surreal was that the flight attendant got on the microphone when we reached the gate and thanked us for flying on that shitty-ass airline and hoped we would fly again. They brought a bus out and one of the pilots came out with us. He didn't say a word, but his knee was shaking uncontrollably. To explicitly answer your question, some people scream and panic in those last few minutes. Others seem to accept the inevitable. In the moment it seems like there isn't much that you can do. It's all in the pilot's hands. I hate flying now. Plane didn't crash, but I sure as hell thought it was going to. I was flying back from Colorado back home to New Jersey. Plane started to descend quickly in the middle of the flight. Everyone looks around confused. Flight attendant is talking to someone on the phone. PA system then immediately sprints to her seat and buckles in. Oxygen masks drop down. More confusion. Then everyone freaks out and puts the masks on. Plane is still dropping quickly. I look around to see kids are crying. I see an older couple holding hands, and a man listening to something on his headphones. Apparently there is a channel on the radio where you can listen in on the captain's radio. I listen in and hear the captain refer to all of us as 100-something souls on board. I think that was the scariest part for some reason. I'm sure it's normal to refer to people as souls, but in that context it was haunting. Ended up having to emergency land in Chicago. Never found out why the plane malfunctioned, but we all got free drinks on the next flight. I was flying to Iraq and the C-5 caught fire. Some electrical problem and smoke started to fill the cabin. A C-5 is a huge bird, and it's also weird because you fly facing the back. So the cabin is filling with smoke and we are somewhere over the ocean. The whole time I'm thinking we have tons of weight in war machines in the belly, and if we hit water we are sinking immediately. Some Air Force guys are walking around the cabin and tell us to reach in the pocket in front of us to grab the oxygen bags. I was expecting a yellow cup that resembled a muzzle, but I pull out a red bag with an elastic band around the neck area. I place it over my head and pull the string, then my eyes start burning like hell. As far as the reaction from us soldiers, we were in the 82nd Airborne Infantry, so we were used to jumping out of airplanes and wanted parachutes. But obviously they didn't have that many. We were all pretty calm. This being our second deployment, the first to Afghanistan no more than 2 months prior. We were all pretty much expecting death at any moment and were joking around. I think a few of the guys were playing keep away with the airbags. We ended up making an emergency landing in Spain at an Air Force base and had to stay for 3 days while they repaired the bird. The entire time we were on lockdown because the Air Force didn't trust infantry soldiers from the 82nd Law. When I was in my crash last summer, no one said anything until the pilot said something right before the wing started to hit trees. The cockpit was silent except for the sounds of the wing, the prop hitting the ground, and the crunching of sheet metal when we ended up in the trees. Upon stopping, the silence was broken when the "everyone okay?" question started. We forced the door open, got our gear out and walked back to the shack next to the runway. Pilot was very unhappy, their personal plane was totaled, but we all walked away. My buddy and I were so hopped up on adrenaline though, it was strange. I wasn't sore until the next day, and an visit saying low back strain was my worst result. I'll end by saying, if you can be in one and walk away from it, do it. Beats the shit outta jumping outta airplanes or being shot at. Great Errol Morris documentary about a DC-10 aircraft where they lost all hydraulics, so literally all control over the airplane. A pilot who tests other pilots on the DC-10. So really experienced guy. His job was to test other pilots in simulators with situations like control losses, etc. Happened to be on board as a passenger and helped them land it. Like half the people died, but if he hadn't been there probably everyone wouldn't have made it. He lived and tells the entire story and is very eloquent and intelligent. I was involved in a ground loop that we both walked away from and the plane remained undamaged. However, it was very close to a crash with substantial damage and injury. A friend of mine took me up in a borrowed Aeronca Champ, which is similar to a J3 Cub in that it is a tube frame aircraft with fabric covering and a taildragger as well. Flight was totally fine and fun, however, on landing the pilot's airspeed on final was approximately 70 miles per hour with a right crosswind of approximately 10 miles per hour. We touched down at 60 miles per hour on the left main first. The right wing immediately came up pushing the left wing within inches of the pavement. This caused the airplane to make an immediate 90-degree turn where we bounded through a snowbank and off into a field. As soon as the aircraft started to ground loop, my only thoughts were to brace for impact, covering my vital torso with my arms, thinking this is going to hurt and I hope I do not get impaled. After making it out okay, I helped him dig the plane out of the snowbank and get it started again, and then, like the idiot I am, hopped back in and went for another ride around the pattern to let him redeem himself. I am currently a student pilot, but have been flying with my parents since I was 8 days old. Edit. Probably shouldn't have put this here since you asked plane, so sorry, hope you enjoy my story anyway. I wasn't in a plane crash, I was in hot air balloon crash, not as dangerous as a plane. We spent ages up in the air, we kept trying to land at an oval or somewhere safe, but the wind picked up as we were flying and blew us into dangerous areas where we couldn't land. The pilot, I think that's what they are still called, told us that we might run out of fuel if this keeps up and he would see what he could do to get us safely down. This continued for a while, and we ended up all crouching down in the basket, as he got the balloon as low as he could as the fuel ran out. We ended up crashing into the top story of a house in the suburbs and scraping most of the tiles off the roof. Someone almost fell out. Luckily the house slowed us down and that street was open enough for the car that had been following us to grab the drop rope and winch the balloon down safely. No one was hurt, thankfully, but scared the shit out of everyone. Unsure if I'd ever go on a balloon ride ever again. I wasn't in a crash, but was in a helicopter when the engine failed. I used to have a job which required me to fly in the helicopter every day as a passenger. One day as we were chugging along, the warning lights start lighting up and alarms are sounding. Luckily we were right next to the airport and the pilot radioed that we need to make an emergency landing. We did what was called an auto-rotate, which means even though the engine quit there is still enough inertia in the blades to land, but you have to land now. The landing was pretty hard, but everyone was okay. I wasn't scared or nervous when it was happening. It happened so fast I don't think I had time to be. But afterwards we were like, what the fuck just happened? I've been in 3 plane crashes, mostly on the runway. My dad has been in many more. 2 in one day. Once, granted one of them he was in a helicopter, part of the territory growing up around bush planes. The most memorable was in a de Havilland DHC-3 single otter on floats. Happened on takeoff. The engine was spooling up and we started to work our way on step when a massive gust of wind picked us straight up into the air about 60 to 100 feet and dropped us. Ended up landing on the left side of the plane. Everyone was a little shook up, but the real danger was that the plane was sinking now. Another guy popped the roof escape hatch and started pulling people up on top. Luckily this happened right around dinner time on a busy lake. Many boats came by to assist and nobody was injured. One guy's pants got wet and the airline's owner bought him new ones. There's not really much to say what I'd actually do with my last minutes of any given crash. It all kind of happens and is over before you know what's going on. It's a little different when you're up front, but even then unless you're actively on the controls you can't do anything. Just accept it and be ready to act when the tumbling is over. Wasn't exactly a crash but a horrendous landing in Kathmandu. We were flying from Kolkata to Kathmandu in the autumn in 1979. It was an amazing flight, weaving among the mountains of northern India, dodging thunderhead formations and heading into the foothills of the Himalayas. Lightning was striking around us but the flight seemed steady and on course. Like I said, weaving through the mountains. The Kathmandu airport is barely an international airport, nestled between 2 amazing mountain ranges. The pilot of our Air India craft literally flew the plane onto the runway and then hit the brakes and reverse thrusters. The overhead compartments popped open and anything loose began bouncing down the aisle. All the seats were thrust forward and our bodies were jackknifed around our seatbelts with our heads against the seats in front of us. We were moving fast. Then the pilot made his turn, bouncing along. We could see out the window that we were at the end of the runway. still moving quite fast. It felt as though the landing gear would collapse with the turn. The plane finally slowed and stopped. No one made a sound. There were no cheers, no tears. Just silence and wide-eyed glances. We later heard that Sir Edmund Hillary's wife and daughter died in a crash off the runway at Kathmandu 4 years earlier. Damn. Not a crash story, but a sphincter tightening moment just the same. I was on a plane once where the pilot came over the PA and said they had an indicator light which showed the landing gear wasn't fully deployed. We did a flyby the tower, and the tower said it looked like the gear was down. Pilot said we would try a landing, and the stewardess had us all make sure our belts were tight and the cabin secure. As we lined up on the runway and started to descend, I could hear a few people quietly mumbling prayers, but for the most part it was quiet and everyone remained calm. We made a perfect landing and taxied to the gate. Before we started to deplane, the pilot came back on the PA and said they had a faulty warning light. I was struck by how candid the flight crew was by telling us exactly what was going on, and how calmly all the passengers remained throughout the event. Not a plane crash, but this is probably the closest I'll get to be able to tell my little story. I was a kid on some big Boeing jet. We were coming in for a landing, engines powered low, flaps extended. We were getting close to the ground when, without warning, the engines roared to full and the plane nearly went vertical. Once we leveled off again, there were confused murmurings from the passengers. The pilot apologized for the sudden maneuver, explaining that control had told them the runway was clear, when in fact we were coming down on a taxiing plane. I'm probably too late for this, but I'll share anyways. I was in a plane crash. We crashed while on the ground. I was 9 years old and flying as an unaccompanied minor, back in '99. So this was the first flight of the morning leaving out of a Colorado airport in December. It had snowed the night before and the roads were pretty icy. All was fine though, they de-iced the plane and we left the gate only 10 minutes later than we should have. We get into position on the runway for takeoff and the pilot begins taking off and getting up to speed. Instead of leaving the ground, however, we slide off the runway at full speed. Everyone was screaming and losing their shit. I actually followed the damn procedures outlined in that stupid manual they tell you to read and put my hands on the seat in front of me, with my head between my arms. Once we came to a stop, our wheel was dug into the ground and we were tilted, with one of the wings dug into the ground. Not really a crash, but plane accident all the same. Back in 1995 when I was 6, I got on a Air India flight from Kuwait to India. I was sitting in the middle and heard people screaming as the plane took off and could see a bright light on the right side of the plane. I believe the engine caught on fire and they shut that off, took a huge turn and landed back to the runway in about a couple minutes. I was pretty much laughing at what was going on because I had no idea how intense the situation was, but there were a lot of scared people on that flight. This wasn't really a plane crash, but more of a dangerous incident that could have led to one, had the incident occurred later. When I was 11 years old, we were taking a flight home from Honolulu to Chicago O'Hare. This particular plane was a massive Boeing 777 with 2 seats on each side aisle and 5 in the middle aisle, spanning about 30 to 40 total rows back for a grand total of more or less 250 people. The plane was fully loaded, ready to take off. We start to jet down the runway, probably 3 seconds from lifting our wheels off the ground when an ear-shattering boom rings throughout the cabin and the lights flicker a bit. People are now gasping and looking to the left of the plane as the tires screech to a quick halt. Being 11 years old, I had no idea what was really going on. It wasn't until we had to tow the plane back to a gate that we were told by the purser over the PA what actually happened to the plane. So to my knowledge, commercial jet engines consist of large, sharp, thin fan blades that spin rapidly to push the plane forward. Well, one of these little blades became loose in the takeoff sequence and got sucked into the engine, hurtling out the back and ripping apart some crucial parts along the way. The entire left engine exploded on our plane. Should this have happened in the air a mere few minutes later, we probably wouldn't have been able to turn around easily to return to the terminal. I'm way too late for this, but whatever. 8 years ago I took a Boeing 747 and most of the flight was uneventful. When we reached my destination I was looking out the window and everything seemed fine. We started seeing the runway. All of a sudden the plane started shaking uncontrollably and I personally saw how the wing almost hit the ground. In that moment the lights went out and a piece of luggage flew from an overhead compartment that hadn't been closed correctly. It made a very loud bang and everybody started to panic. People were screaming like crazy and you could hear every deity being called by name. This lasted less than 10 seconds and we were back in the air normally. A couple of minutes later, the pilot told us in a totally calm voice that unexpected weather in our destination had led to us circling it for another half hour. I convinced myself the pilot's calmness was proof enough that we had overreacted and was just happy to see my family after the trip. From the airport to my home, most areas were black WD out, large city, long drive, highly unusual. Trees were pulled out of the ground like it was nothing, cars were damaged, etc. This is common in tornado areas or the like, but I hadn't seen this in my city in my 20 years up to that day. Turns out the unexpected weather refers to winds that broke every single speed record for my city ever measured. There were news reports on the storm on TV next day and they explained it was completely unexpected. It just happened out of the blue in a matter of minutes and was gone just as fast. What they never mentioned is that pure plane was trying to land as this unfolded. I convinced myself that it just hadn't been that close or important. Some weeks later, I'm at a party for a friend and one of his uncles mentioned something about working for the airline in passing. I asked him about my flight and he was really thrilled and nervous to learn that I had been on that plane. "You're kidding me, aren't you? That was so fucking close for you guys. They're doing a whole investigation and evaluation of the whole incident." I was floored. I never really learned the whole truth about that night, but I believe it was one of the closest calls a jumbo has had in the last years. Well, this wasn't a crash, but after reading the other responses, this reminds me of a particular flight. It was particularly foggy in LA, and we were going in for a landing in a Boeing 737 that was pretty full. Couldn't see a thing out the windows, then we started accelerating and going back up. The captain came on and said that they couldn't see the runway and had to execute a missed approach and go around and try to land again. I thought nothing of it myself because my parents were private pilots, and I knew enough about what it meant that it didn't concern me in the least. In fact, I was thinking, oh neat, so I went back to reading my book. So we circled around and went down again and landed quite normally, but when we touched down there was a large audible sigh of relief in the cabin from the other passengers. I hadn't even acknowledged until they sighed that it had been particularly quiet after the announcement. I guess missed approach could sound scary, and in all the time I've flown I've never had to go around again, so I guess I can see how that might be disconcerting for some. So yeah, the anecdotal evidence is mounting that scared passengers are mostly quiet and keep to themselves.